Bikers taunt a man at a gas station. What he does next leaves them running scared. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the near-empty gas station. The faint hum of traffic from the nearby highway was the only sound, aside from the occasional beep of a car filling up. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and burnt rubber, mixing with the distant aroma of fried food from the convenience store inside. It was the kind of place where people stopped for gas and left as quickly as possible. But tonight, something was different. Daniel Carter stood by his car, filling the tank, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed. He was dressed in a brown leather jacket, worn jeans, and scuffed boots, nothing remarkable about him at first glance. Just another guy on the road. But there was something about the way he moved, the way his eyes flicked over his surroundings, like a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. He wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble had found him. A low growl of engines rumbled in the distance, growing louder as 5 motorcycles rolled into the station, their chrome bodies glinting under the flickering fluorescent lights. The bikers pulled up in a row, parking near Daniel's car, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. The air seemed heavier, tense. The gas station attendant behind the counter inside glanced up briefly, then quickly looked away. He wasn't getting involved. Leading the pack was a tall, rugged man in a black leather jacket, his beard streaked with gray, eyes sharp as a hawk's. Jackson Reaper Mills. His reputation was well known in these parts, leader of the Iron Teeth MC, a gang that thrived on intimidation. He killed with his fists, his words, and, when necessary, his blade. Beside him, 4 of his men, Duke, Rocco, Slim, and Vic, watched Daniel like wolves sizing up prey. Reaper swung a leg off his bike, stretching lazily as he walked toward the pumps. His gaze settled on Daniel's motorcycle parked nearby, sleek, well-maintained, military precision in every detail. It didn't fit the look of some random traveler. It looked like it belonged to a man who understood discipline. "Nice bike," Reaper said, his voice dripping with casual menace. "Doesn't seem like it belongs to you." Daniel didn't respond right away. He finished fueling his car, set the nozzle back in place, and only then turned his head slightly. His face was unreadable. "It's mine." Reaper smirked, glancing at his men. Duke chuckled under his breath. "You sure about that, buddy? Looks more like the kind of ride someone like us would own." Daniel exhaled slowly. He wasn't looking for a fight. But he could feel it creeping closer, slithering into the cracks of the conversation. He'd seen men like these before, bullies who mistook numbers for strength. He met Reaper's eyes, calm but firm. "Then I guess you'd be mistaken." Slim took a step closer, running a gloved hand along Daniel's bike. "Must have cost a pretty penny. Be a shame if someone took it for a ride." Daniel didn't move. Didn't react. He simply watched them, his silence more unsettling than aggression. Reaper arched a brow. "What's the matter, friend? Cat got your tongue?" He tapped a knuckle against Daniel's car roof, the sound hollow in the quiet night. "You lost or something?" Still, Daniel remained composed. "No." Rocco grinned, leaning in. "Then why do you look so damn nervous?" Daniel let out a breath, slow and measured. He wasn't nervous. He was calculating. Measuring their movements, their spacing, the way their weight shifted when they stood. They thought they had control. That was their first mistake. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice steady. "You're making a mistake." The bikers exchanged glances before bursting into laughter. Reaper shook his head. "Oh yeah? And what kind of mistake would that be?" Daniel didn't blink. "The kind you don't walk away from." For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that stretched thin, ready to snap. Then, like a match struck in the dark, the bikers exploded into laughter. Loud, mocking, their voices echoing through the quiet gas station. Reaper shook his head, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. "Did you hear that, boys? This guy thinks he's some kind of badass." Slim leaned against Daniel's bike, drumming his fingers along the handlebars. Maybe he's a movie star. You know, one of those tough guys from TV. Daniel didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He'd seen this before. A pack of wolves circling their target, testing its defenses before going for the throat. What they didn't know was that this wasn't his first time in the ring. Reaper's grin faded slightly when Daniel didn't react the way most people would. No backing away, no desperate explanations, no nervous glances at the exit. He just stood there, calm. Unmoved. That was unusual. Reaper stepped closer, invading Daniel's personal space. He was taller by an inch, bulkier by at least 20 pounds. The kind of man who won fights because people assumed he would. You got a death wish, stranger? Reaper's voice was quieter now, almost casual. 'Cause we can arrange that real quick. Daniel exhaled slowly. I don't have a death wish. He paused. Then, for the first time, his expression shifted, just the slightest hint of a smirk at the corner of his mouth. But if I did, you wouldn't be the ones to deliver it. The laughter stopped. A subtle shift in the air. The kind that only the most perceptive could sense. Reaper's face hardened, and his men straightened. The game was over. Now, it was about dominance. Rocco, the tallest of the group, cracked his knuckles and took a step forward. You got a smart mouth, old man. Let's see if your fists can back it up. He lunged. Fast. But not fast enough. Daniel sidestepped effortlessly, his movement fluid, almost lazy. He barely exerted effort, yet Rocco stumbled past him, thrown off balance. Before Rocco could recover, Daniel's hand shot out, gripping his wrist like a vice. A sharp twist. Crack. Rocco let out a strangled cry and collapsed to one knee, clutching his arm. The other bikers froze. Reaper's eyes narrowed. What the hell? Daniel released Rocco and took a single step back. His posture still relaxed, still calm. As if nothing had happened. I warned you, Daniel said simply. Slim's eyes darted between Rocco and Daniel, confusion clouding his features. Boss, what? Reaper cut him off with a sharp look. There was no way this guy should have been able to do that. Not with that much ease. Not with that much precision. And yet, Rocco was on the ground, gasping in pain. Reaper's gaze flicked to Daniel's hands. They weren't shaking. That was the part that made his stomach tighten. Most people would be buzzing with adrenaline, fists clenched, body stiff. But Daniel? He looked bored. Like he'd been here before. Like he'd done this 100 times. Like he was already 3 steps ahead. The realization slithered into Reaper's mind, cold and unwelcome. They had messed with the wrong guy. But he couldn't back down now. Not in front of his men. His jaw tightened. All right, tough guy, he said, his voice dangerously low. You wanna play? Let's play. The gas station was silent except for the distant hum of the highway. Rocco was still on one knee, cradling his arm, his face twisted in pain. The other bikers weren't laughing anymore. Daniel stood exactly where he had been the whole time. He hadn't moved much, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even looked particularly angry. But he had just taken down the biggest man in the group without breaking a sweat. That was a problem. Reaper clenched his jaw, stepping forward. His boots scraped against the pavement as he moved, slow and deliberate. You think that little trick means something? He growled. You think you can just walk away after embarrassing us? Daniel exhaled through his nose, almost like he was disappointed. It wasn't a trick. And you embarrassed yourselves. Slim took a step toward Daniel's bike again, trying to reclaim some of the lost intimidation. He ran his hand along the seat, curling his fingers around the handlebar. If you don't want trouble, old man, you better start talking real nice. Daniel's eyes flicked toward Slim, but only for a second. Step away from the bike, he said evenly. Slim grinned. Or what? Reaper smirked at Slim's boldness. Finally, someone was getting the upper hand in this situation. Daniel blinked once. "Or you won't be riding yours home." The grin faded slightly. Slim scoffed, but there was hesitation in his movements now. The way Daniel said it, it wasn't a threat. It was a fact. And that made it worse. Reaper had seen enough. This wasn't just some ordinary guy passing through. Something was off about him. The way he moved. The way he stayed calm. The way he had taken down Rocco with clinical precision. This wasn't his first fight. And more importantly, he wasn't worried about how it would end. But Reaper was too deep now. He had a reputation. He couldn't just let some nobody embarrass them at a gas station in front of his crew. He stepped in closer. "I don't know who the hell you think you are," he said, voice low and dangerous, "but you've got one chance to apologize. Right now. Before things get ugly." Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if considering it. Then he shook his head. "No." Reaper felt something snap inside him. Slim reached for Daniel's bike again. And then, it happened. Daniel moved. 1 second, Slim's hand was on the bike. The next, he was flat on his back, gasping for air. No one had even seen what happened. Reaper blinked. Slim was just lying there, staring at the sky, struggling to breathe. Daniel's stance was still relaxed, like he hadn't moved at all. But he had. And they all knew it. "What the hell?" Duke started, taking a step back. Slim coughed, rolling onto his side. I couldn't breathe." Reaper's stomach twisted. This was wrong. Daniel sighed. "I told you to step away from the bike." For the first time, Vic, who hadn't said a word the entire time, took a step back. That was all it took. Because if Vic was scared, then they were in serious trouble. Reaper was losing control. And he hated it. He had to do something. He had to put Daniel in his place. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. The knife glinted under the gas station's fluorescent lights. Reaper flipped it open with a practiced flick of his wrist, his grip firm, his knuckles white. He wasn't smiling anymore. The amusement was gone. Now, it was about saving face. Daniel's expression didn't change. His eyes didn't flicker to the weapon, didn't widen in alarm. He simply let out a slow breath, as if Reaper pulling a knife was the most predictable thing in the world. Slim was still on the ground, groaning, clutching his ribs. Rocco hadn't moved much since Daniel had twisted his wrist. Duke and Vic exchanged uneasy glances, shifting their weight, their confidence cracking. Reaper had to act fast. His gang was falling apart right in front of him. He took a step forward, knife raised. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" His voice was lower now, angrier. "You think you can just make fools of us and walk away?" Daniel still didn't move. Still didn't blink. Then, finally, he spoke. "You should put that away." Reaper barked a laugh, but it wasn't real. It was forced, covering something else. Something cold in his chest. "You're giving me advice now?" He sneered. "Or is that a threat?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, his voice level. "It's a warning." The silence stretched. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, waiting for Reaper to make the next move. And he did. With a sharp breath, he lunged. It happened in a blur. Reaper barely registered what was going on before he felt his entire world flip upside down. One moment, he was attacking. The next, he was on the ground, his wrist pinned, the knife no longer in his hand. It was now in Daniel's. Held with casual ease, like it belonged there. The gas station lights buzzed overhead. Reaper stared up at Daniel, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had never been put down so fast. Daniel crouched beside him, rolling the knife between his fingers. His grip was loose, but Reaper knew, it would take nothing for him to use it. The realization hit like a freight train. This guy wasn't just tough. He wasn't just some drifter who knew how to throw a punch. He was trained. And that meant one thing: Reaper never stood a chance. Duke took a hesitant step forward. "Boss?" Daniel's eyes flicked up, locking onto him. Duke froze. Daniel let out another slow breath before flipping the knife in his hand, and stabbing it into the pavement between them. It stuck there, vibrating slightly from the force. And then Daniel stood, looking down at Reaper like a man who had already won. "Walk away," he said, voice calm. "All of you." No one moved. Not at first. Then Vic did something Reaper never thought he'd see. He stepped back, turned, and walked toward his bike. One by one, the others followed. Slim was the last to move, wincing as he pulled himself to his feet. He hesitated, glancing between Daniel and Reaper, before finally hurrying after the others. Reaper clenched his jaw. His heart pounded. But he knew. He knew he had already lost. Daniel stepped past him, toward his bike. Before getting on, he looked over his shoulder. "You should pick better fights." Reaper's fists curled against the pavement, but he didn't say a word. Daniel started his engine. The sound of the rumbling motor was the only noise as he rode off into the night. And Reaper? For the first time in his life, he didn't chase. Reaper stayed on the ground, his hands pressing into the rough pavement, his breathing shallow. His body screamed for him to move, to stand, to do something, but his mind was locked in a fog of disbelief. Daniel was already straddling his bike, ready to leave, as if this whole encounter had been nothing more than an inconvenience. As if Reaper and his gang had never been a threat at all. Duke and Vic were already backing toward their bikes, their hands shaking as they fumbled with their helmets. Slim wiped sweat from his forehead, still clutching his ribs. Rocco held his wrist like it was shattered, his face pale from pain. They were broken. Reaper couldn't let this happen. He couldn't just let some nobody roll in, humiliate him in front of his men, and ride off into the night like it was nothing. His entire reputation, his entire identity, was built on fear. On control. And right now, he had neither. A deep growl rumbled in his chest as he pushed himself onto his knees, then his feet. His head spun, his muscles burned, but none of that mattered. His rage was the only thing keeping him upright. Daniel was turning his key in the ignition when Reaper's voice cut through the air. "You don't walk away from me." Daniel sighed, his shoulders rising and falling before he slowly turned his head. His expression was the same, calm, unreadable. But this time, there was a flicker of something else in his gaze. Not fear. Not anger. Disappointment. Reaper's fingers curled into fists. His pride demanded one last shot at regaining control. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out his last resort. A gun. Duke muttered a curse under his breath. "Boss, don't." Reaper ignored him, leveling the pistol at Daniel's chest. His hands trembled, just slightly, but the rage boiling in his blood drowned out the doubt. "You think you're untouchable?" Reaper spat. "Let's see how tough you are when you're staring down a barrel." Daniel didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't even acknowledge the gun. Instead, he tilted his head. And that's when it happened. For the first time since the encounter began, Reaper felt fear. It wasn't the kind of fear he was used to. Not the kind that came from knowing you were about to take a punch or get in a fight you might not win. This was different. This was the primal, bone-deep fear of a man who just realized he made the worst mistake of his life. Because Daniel wasn't afraid. Not even a little. He took a step forward. Reaper flinched. That was all it took. Duke saw it. Vic saw it. Slim and Rocco saw it. Their leader was afraid. And just like that, he wasn't their leader anymore. Daniel stopped just outside arm's reach, his eyes locked onto Reaper's. And then, in a voice so quiet yet so absolute, he spoke. If you were going to use that, you would have already pulled the trigger. Reaper's breath hitched. Daniel took another step. But you didn't. Another step. Because you're not in control anymore. Reaper staggered back. His finger hovered over the trigger, but he couldn't pull it. Daniel took the final step, until the barrel of the gun was pressed against his chest. And then, he reached up. And pulled it away. Reaper let it go without a fight. Daniel ejected the magazine with one hand, letting it drop to the pavement. Then he racked the slide, ejecting the bullet from the chamber, and let the empty gun fall at Reaper's feet. He leaned in close, voice barely above a whisper. "Walk away." And Reaper? He did. Because for the first time in his life, he knew he had no other choice. Reaper stumbled back, his breathing ragged, his mind spinning. His fingers twitched at his sides, but he didn't reach for the gun. He didn't try to fight. Because it was over. His men saw it. They all saw it. The leader they had followed, the man they feared and respected, was standing there powerless, with nothing left but his own wounded pride. Daniel hadn't even hit him. Hadn't needed to. Because the real fight had never been physical. It had been psychological. And Reaper had lost. The others didn't say a word. Duke avoided eye contact. Slim wiped the sweat off his brow, still rubbing his ribs. Rocco cradled his wrist, wincing. Even Vic, the most loyal, stood motionless, like he was waiting for something. Daniel let out a slow breath. He reached down, picked up the empty gun, and tossed it onto the hood of Reaper's bike. Then he turned to leave. Just like that. No insults. No speeches. No need to rub it in. But that silence. It was worse than any words. Because it told them exactly how little this fight had meant to him. Exactly how insignificant they were. Reaper's fists clenched. His body shook, not with anger, but with humiliation. He had never been dismissed like this before. His voice came out hoarse, almost desperate. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel stopped. He was quiet for a long moment, as if debating whether or not to answer. Then, finally, he turned his head just slightly, his voice calm, measured. "I used to be someone you wouldn't want to meet." A pause. Then, with the faintest trace of something dangerous in his tone, he added, "You still don't." Reaper's breath caught in his throat. Duke took a step back. Slim let out a shaky exhale. And that's when it clicked. This guy wasn't just some fighter. He wasn't some ex-cop or retired bouncer. He was something worse. Something they didn't want to mess with. Daniel turned back toward his bike, adjusting his jacket like nothing had happened. His movements were methodical, controlled, the kind of control that only came from years of discipline. Maybe military. Maybe something deeper. But whatever he was before, he hadn't forgotten how to be it. Reaper swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything, to take back control. But his body wouldn't move. Because now, he was the one paralyzed. And Daniel? He was already starting his engine. A low, steady growl filled the air as he shifted gears, the rumble of his motorcycle drowning out the tension that hung heavy in the gas station. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. Because he already knew. They would never come after him again. As Daniel rolled forward, past the row of stunned bikers, he spared them one final glance. "Pick your fights better." Then, without another word, he pulled onto the highway, disappearing into the night. And the Iron Teeth MC? They stood there, silent. Their leader broken. Their fear undeniable. And for the first time in their lives, they knew. They had been lucky. Because whoever Daniel Carter was, they had survived meeting him. Daniel's motorcycle roared down the highway, its deep rumble fading into the distance as the Iron Teeth MC stood frozen in place. Reaper's jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths. His fingers twitched at his sides, but he didn't reach for the gun again. He didn't move at all. Because for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. The others were just as stunned. Duke kept shifting his weight, his eyes flicking between Reaper and the road where Daniel had disappeared. Slim rubbed his ribs, wincing with every breath. Rocco flexed his injured wrist with a grimace, avoiding looking at his leader. Even Vic, the one who never showed fear, stood with his hands stuffed in his pockets, his mouth pressed into a thin line. No one spoke. Because there was nothing to say. Reaper had lost. Not just the fight. Not just the control. He had lost everything that made him the man they feared. His reputation. His dominance. His ability to command. It was all gone. Finally, Duke let out a breath, slow and deliberate, breaking the silence. "We should go." Reaper's eyes snapped to him. "What?" Duke gestured toward the bikes, then toward the gas station attendant, who was still standing behind the counter, pretending not to have seen a thing but obviously listening. "We look like idiots just standing here." Reaper's fists curled. He wanted to snap, to lash out, to tell Duke to shut his mouth and fall in line. But the words wouldn't come. Because Duke was right. They did look like idiots. And there was nothing Reaper could do about it. Slim coughed, shifting awkwardly. "Boss, let's just..." "I know," Reaper snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. The others flinched slightly at his tone, and that realization sent a fresh wave of anger through him. They were all looking at him differently now. Like he wasn't the same man he had been an hour ago. Like they had seen something they weren't supposed to see. Like they had seen him lose. And that was unforgivable. He forced his hands to unclench and took a slow, steadying breath. "Mount up." The others obeyed without hesitation. Not out of loyalty, not out of fear, but because they just wanted to leave. And Reaper knew it. As they rolled onto the highway, the wind whipping against their faces, the tension didn't fade. It sat heavy in Reaper's chest, gnawing at his pride. He replayed the fight over and over in his head, trying to find the moment it all went wrong. Was it when Rocco went down? Was it when Slim couldn't land a hit? Was it when Daniel took his knife, or when he dismantled the gun with terrifying ease? Or was it before all of that, when Daniel looked him in the eye and never once saw him as a threat? Reaper gritted his teeth, twisting the throttle harder, as if speed could erase the humiliation. But it didn't. Nothing would. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Iron Teeth MC pulled off onto a side road, stopping beneath a cluster of trees. The only light came from the moon and the dull glow of their taillights. No one spoke at first. Then Duke exhaled. What the hell was that? Reaper's grip on his handlebars tightened, but he didn't answer. Slim shook his head. Who was that guy? Rocco flexed his wrist again, his expression unreadable. I don't know, but I don't ever want to see him again. Vic nodded. We were lucky. He let us walk. That hit Reaper like a punch to the gut. Let us walk. As if they had no choice in the matter. As if they had survived by his mercy alone. And the worst part? They were right. Reaper's stomach twisted. We don't talk about this. The others looked at him. He turned, eyes dark and filled with something that wasn't rage, wasn't defiance. It was fear. We don't mention his name. We don't go looking for him. And if we ever see him again, we turn around and leave. Silence. Then, one by one, they nodded. Because they understood. They had spent years making other people afraid of them. And tonight, they had finally learned what real fear felt like.